This is the story of the USS Squalus and of 33 men trapped in their sunken submarine at the fearful depth of 240 feet below the surface.
They called him Swede Momsen, and most people thought he was insane. He wanted to lower a giant steel bell to the bottom of the ocean to rescue men trapped in a submarine. It had never been done before. It was a self-harm mission in all but name. But the men trapped inside the USS Squalus had no other choice. As the rescue team descended into the darkness, they weren't just fighting the pressure, they were fighting a mystery. The things they saw through the thick glass viewports of the sunken sub were enough to give veteran divers nightmares for the rest of their lives. Down in seconds. It was supposed to be a perfect morning. May 23, 1939. The USS Squalus was the sharpest weapon the United States Navy had. She was brand new, sleek, and cost over $5 million. That is nearly $100 million in today's money. The crew was handpicked. They were the best of the best. The plan was simple. Take the sub out off the coast of New Hampshire, dive down, run some tests, come back up for lunch. But here is the catch. When you deal with submarines, simple does not exist. A submarine is basically a bubble of air trying to survive in a world that wants to crush it. Lieutenant Oliver Nacken was the captain. He was a cool customer. He had done this 100 times. He gave the order to dive. The alarm sounded. The klaxon screamed through the ship. You know that sound from the movies. Ahooga, ahooga. Crew members rushed to their stations. The main engine shut down. The electric motors kicked in. The Squalus slipped under the waves. Everything looked perfect. On the control board, there was a row of lights. These lights told the captain if the ship was sealed up tight. The most important light was for the high induction valve. Think of the induction valve like a giant nostril. When the sub is on the surface, this huge 30-inch pipe sucks in air for the massive diesel engines. But when you dive, that nostril has to close. If it stays open, you are basically opening a barn door to the Atlantic Ocean. Nacken looked at the board. The light was green. Green means closed. Green means safe. But it was not safe. It is not that simple, though. As the Squalus passed 50 feet deep, a radio man looked up. He saw a flutter of air pressure in his ears. Then he heard a roar. It wasn't a drip, it wasn't a leak, it was a catastrophe. Thousands of gallons of freezing cold seawater were blasting into the engine room. Imagine a fire hose, but 10 times bigger and with the pressure of the deep ocean behind it. The force was so violent it knocked men off their feet. The air in the engine room was instantly compressed. The water didn't just rise, it swirled and smashed everything in its path. The green light was a lie. The valve was wide open. Now, this is where the wild theories start to creep in. How could a brand new mechanical system fail so badly? And why did the light say it was safe? Some people at the time whispered about sabotage. The world was on the brink of World War II. Spies were everywhere. Could someone have tampered with the valve? Could someone have messed with the wiring to make the light show green? We may never know for sure. But the result was instant chaos. In the control room, Nacken felt the ship lurch. The heavy water in the back was dragging the tail of the submarine down. The nose pointed up at a steep angle. Dishes crashed in the galley. Tools slid across the floor. Men tumbled into each other. Nacken shouted to blow the ballast tanks. He wanted to shoot high-pressure air into the tanks to make the ship light again. He wanted to bounce back to the surface. They hit the switches. The air hissed, but it was too late. The weight of the water in the back was too much. The laws of physics had taken over. The Squalus began to slide backward. It was falling into the abyss. Imagine the feeling in your stomach when an elevator drops too fast. Now imagine that feeling lasting for minutes while you are locked in a steel box, pitching backward into the dark. The depth gauge spun. 100 feet, 150 feet, 200 feet. They were going to hit bottom. The crash was massive. The Squalus slammed into the mud at 243 feet. The impact threw everyone against the bulkheads. The lights flickered and died. Then absolute silence. Well, not total silence. In the forward torpedo room, the survivors could hear the groaning of the hull. The steel was adjusting to the crushing pressure of the deep. 243 feet is a lot of water. The pressure down there is over 100 pounds per square inch. It wants to squeeze the submarine like a soda can. But the Squalus held. The forward hull was intact. However, the men in the front knew something terrifying. They knew the layout of the ship. They knew that the engine room, the aft sleeping quarters, and the aft torpedo room were behind them. And they knew that the watertight door separating them from the back of the ship was closed. On the other side of that door was the ocean, and 26 of their friends. Nakin did a head count. There were 33 men alive in the front section. That meant 26 men were missing. The survivors were now trapped in a cold, dark bubble. They had no radio. The batteries were running low. The air was starting to get stale. And get this, they were sitting in the mud off the coast of New Hampshire, and nobody on the surface knew anything had gone wrong yet. The clock was ticking, but the real nightmare was just getting started. Colder than the grave. The temperature dropped fast. The water outside was 39 degrees Fahrenheit. That is barely above freezing. Inside the unheated submarine, the steel hull acted like a refrigerator. The men were wearing light work uniforms. They didn't have heavy coats. They huddled together in the darkness, sharing body warmth. They grabbed blankets from the bunks and wrapped them around the group. But the cold wasn't the biggest enemy. The air was. You have to understand the chemistry of a submarine disaster. It is not just about running out of oxygen. It is about carbon dioxide. As we breathe, we exhale CO2. In a sealed room, that CO2 builds up. If it gets too high, you get a headache, then you get confused. Then you pass out and you never wake up. Nakin was a smart leader. He knew that panic increases heart rate, and a high heart rate uses more oxygen, so he ordered everyone to stay still. No moving unless necessary. No talking unless necessary. They lay there in the freezing dark, listening. And this is where the mystery gets deeper. Some survivors later claimed they heard things, sounds coming from the other side of the watertight door, the flooded side. Was it the hull settling? Was it loose equipment banging against the walls? Or was it something else? Some theorists believe that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in the back drowned instantly. The engine room flooded fast. But what about the aft torpedo room? Could there have been an air pocket back there? If there was, those men would have been trapped in total darkness with the water rising, knowing there was no way out. The survivors in the front tried to tap on the bulkhead. They used hammers to tap out codes. Tap, tap, tap. Silence. They listened for a response, a tap back, a sign of life, but only the ocean answered. The psychological toll was immense. Every creak of the ship sounded like the hull was about to give way. And then there was the chlorine gas threat. Submarine batteries are big and heavy. They are located in the bottom of the ship. If salt water mixes with the battery acid, it creates chlorine gas. Chlorine gas is deadly. It burns your lungs. It turns into hydrochloric acid when it hits the moisture in your throat. Nakin had to check the battery wells. If he smelled that bleach-like smell of chlorine, he knew they were done for. He crawled to the test valve. He cracked it open just a tiny bit. He sniffed. Clean. For now, the batteries were dry, but the air was getting thick. They spread soda lime powder on the bunks. Soda lime is a chemical that absorbs carbon dioxide, but it is messy and it burns your skin if you touch it. They waited. Hours passed. On the surface, the Navy finally realized something was wrong. The Squalus had missed her check-in time. They sent another sub, the USS Sculpin, to look for her. The Sculpin arrived at the coordinates. They scanned the water. Nothing. Just gray waves. But then a lookout on the Sculpin saw a puff of red smoke. Naquin had fired a distress rocket from a special ejector tube. It was a 1 in a million shot. If the lookout had been looking the other way, he would have missed it. The Sculpin moved in. They saw a buoy. The Squalus had a marker buoy. It was a yellow float attached to a cable that reeled up from the deck. It had a telephone inside. The captain of the Sculpin grabbed the phone. He shouted into the handset, "Hello, Squalus, is anyone there?" Imagine the relief in the control room of the Squalus when that phone rang. Nakin picked it up. His voice was calm, almost scary calm. "This is Nakin. High induction open. Crew 33 alive, 26 missing." They had contact. But then the ocean decided to be cruel again. The waves picked up. The Sculpin rolled. The cable snapped. The line went dead. The buoy drifted away. The connection was broken. The survivors were alone again. Back on the surface, the news hit the radio. The whole country was listening. It was like the Apollo 13 of the 1930s. Everyone was asking, can we get them out? The experts said no. 240 feet is too deep. Divers can't work there for long. The pressure causes the bends. If you come up too fast, nitrogen bubbles form in your blood and cripple or kill you. There was no way to simply open the hatch and swim up. Your lungs would explode from the pressure change. The Navy was getting ready to write the condolence letters. They were preparing to declare the men lost. But there was one man who didn't accept that. His name was Charles Momsen. His friends called him Swede, and he had a crazy idea, a metal bell, a glorified elevator. He had been building it for years, but nobody took him seriously. They called it a toy. They said it would never work in the open ocean. But now it was the only hope they had. Swede Momsen was already on his way. He was bringing his experimental diving bell to the site. He knew the odds were against him. He knew that one mistake would kill everyone inside the bell and the survivors in the sub. But he was going to try anyway, and what happened next was a miracle of engineering. Engineering the impossible. You have to understand who Swede Momsen was. He was a maverick, a rebel. He had been kicked out of the Naval Academy for a bit because he liked to party too much, but he was also a genius. He had seen men die in submarines before, and he swore he would find a way to save them. His invention was officially called the McCann Rescue Chamber, but everyone just called it the Bell. It looked like a giant pear-shaped steel tumbler. It was heavy, clunky, and ugly. Here is how it was supposed to work. A diver would go down to the sub and attach a cable to the hatch. Then the bell would use a motor to reel itself down that cable like a spider climbing down a web. When it hit the sub, a rubber gasket on the bottom would press against the steel ring around the hatch. Then the operators inside the bell would pump out the water between the bell and the sub. If the seal held, the pressure would drop. They could open the hatch, load the survivors, and go back up. If the seal failed, the ocean would rush in with the force of a cannonball and crush everyone instantly. It sounds crazy because it was crazy. The rescue ship, the USS Falcon, arrived. Momsen was on board. The weather was foggy. The sea was choppy. They sent the first diver down. Martin Subitsky. Going down to 240 feet in 1939 was like going to the moon. Subitsky wore a heavy canvas suit and a massive copper helmet. He was breathing a mixture of helium and oxygen to prevent nitrogen narcosis, that drunken feeling deep divers get. Subitsky landed on the deck of the Squalus. It was pitch black. His light beam cut through the silt. He found the hatch. He connected the downhaul cable. He signaled the surface. Send down the bell. Inside the bell were two operators. They were risking their lives just as much as the survivors. The bell started to descend. Whirr! The motor groaned. The bell spun slowly in the current. Down, down, down. Inside the Squalus, the survivors heard a clank. Something had landed on the roof. Was it the rescue or was it debris? Nakin told his men to stand by. The operators in the bell started the pumps. They watched the gauges. If the needle didn't move, the seal was bad. The needle moved. The water was draining. The seal was holding. They banged on the hatch. Open up! Inside the sub, the men cracked the wheel of the hatch. Air hissed. The heavy steel door swung open, and there, looking down at them, were two men in clean uniforms. "Hello, fellows," one of the operators said. "We're here to take you home." It was a moment of pure emotion. Men wept, they hugged, but they couldn't take everyone at once. The bell was small, it was cramped. They had to do it in shifts. 7 men went up on the first trip. The bell disconnected and rose to the surface. It broke the water. The hatch opened. The first survivors breathed fresh air for the first time in 30 hours. They sent the bell down again. Trip 2, success. Trip 3, success. Then came Trip 4, the last trip. This was for Lieutenant Nakin and the last few men. They climbed in, they sealed the hatch, the bell started to rise, but then disaster. At about 150 feet, the bell stopped. The cable jammed, the motor whined and smoked. The operators tried to fix it, but the wire was frayed. Ping, ping. Strands of the steel cable started to snap. They were dangling in the middle of the ocean. If the cable broke completely, the bell would drop like a stone. It would hit the bottom, roll over, and likely kill everyone inside. They were stuck. For 4 hours, they hung there. Imagine surviving the crash, surviving the cold, surviving the chlorine threat, getting into the rescue bell, and then getting stuck halfway home. Nakin kept his men calm. He told them stories. He joked. Meanwhile, on the surface, divers were diving frantically. They had to manually cut the jammed wire. It was dangerous work. If the bell swung and hit a diver, it would crush him. Finally, after an eternity, the wire was cut. The crew on the surface hauled the bell up by a safety line, hand over hand, inch by inch. When the bell finally broke the surface, the crowd cheered. All 33 men from the forward section were alive. It was the greatest submarine rescue in history. Swede Momsen was a hero, but the story doesn't end with the rescue because the Navy had unfinished business. The Squalus was still on the bottom. And inside the aft section, 26 men were still waiting. The Navy wanted to raise the sub. They wanted to know why the valve failed, and this is where the story turns into a horror movie. What the divers found when they looked into the back of the ship was chilling. The ghostly diver. Raising a 1,500-ton submarine from the mud is not easy. It took 113 days. Divers had to tunnel under the hull to slide heavy chains beneath it. They used high-pressure hoses to blast the mud away. It was grueling work. The divers were constantly exhausted. They were fighting the cold and the dark, and they were fighting their own minds. At that depth, nitrogen narcosis is real. It makes you see things. It makes you hear things. Some divers reported feeling like they were being watched. They would look into the thick glass portholes of the Squalus and swear they saw movement inside. Was it a fish? Was it a trick of the light? Or was it the bodies of the lost crew floating in the current? The Wild Theories crowd has a lot to say about this part. There are stories, unconfirmed of course, of divers seeing faces pressed against the glass. Faces that didn't look peaceful. When they finally attached the pontoons, giant balloons, to the sub, they started to lift it. But the Squalus fought back. On the first attempt, the sub shot up to the surface way too fast. It breached the water like a giant whale, crashed back down, and sank again. It was like the ship didn't want to leave the bottom. Finally, on September 13, 1939, they got her up. They towed her to the dry dock in Portsmouth. The water was pumped out. The hatches were opened. This is the part that is hard to talk about. The interior of the aft section was a chaotic mess. The water had smashed everything. But amidst the wreckage, there were heartbreaking scenes frozen in time. In the engine room, the bodies of the crew were found. They weren't just floating randomly. Some were clustered near the highest points of the room. This tells us something terrifying. They didn't all die instantly. When the water rushed in, it trapped air pockets at the top of the room. The men had climbed up the pipes. They had clung to the machinery, breathing the last few inches of air as the water rose around their necks. They had waited in the dark, screaming until the air ran out. In the aft torpedo room, they found something even sadder. A sailor named Sherman Shirley was found near the telephone handset. He had died trying to call for help. He had stayed at his post, trying to warn the bridge, even as the water crushed him. And then there were the personal items. Floating in the oil and muck were letters. Unfinished letters to wives and girlfriends. There was a pair of cowboy boots, a lucky coin, a picture of a baby. It wasn't just a ship, it was a time capsule of 26 lives cut short. But there is one specific detail that haunts investigators. In the escape trunk, a small airlock used for leaving the sub, they found a body. This man hadn't drowned. The theory is that he had managed to get into the airlock. He had sealed himself in. He was safe from the water, but he couldn't open the outer hatch. The pressure was too great. He had sat there in that tiny steel box alone. He had waited for a rescue that came too late for him. He had likely suffocated peacefully when the oxygen ran out. He just went to sleep. This leads to the 27th survivor theory. How long did he live? Did he hear the rescue bell land on the forward deck? Did he hear the footsteps of his friends leaving? We will never know. The official report confirmed that the main induction valve was open, but the mechanism that controlled the green light had failed. It was a mechanical error, a broken gear. But that explanation didn't satisfy everyone. Why did the gear break? Was it poor manufacturing, or was it something more sinister? The Squalus was a cursed ship. That was the word around the shipyard, and the Navy did something that fueled that fire. They didn't scrap the Squalus. They cleaned it out. They hosed down the inside, they rewired it, they put in new engines, and they gave it a new name, the USS Sailfish. But you can't just paint over a tragedy. The ghost of the Squalus was still on board. The legacy of the lost. The sailors called her the Squalefish. Nobody wanted to serve on her. They said she was haunted. Crew members reported weird things, tools going missing, cold spots in the engine room, the sound of water rushing when the ship was perfectly dry. But there was a war on, the Navy needed ships, so the Sailfish went to the Pacific to fight Japan. And she was good. She was a hunter. She sank Japanese ships left and right. She earned 9 battle stars. The ship that couldn't dive right ended up being a hero. But the universe has a twisted sense of humor. In 1943, the Sailfish was patrolling near Japan. The radar picked up a target, a massive Japanese aircraft carrier, the Chuyo. The captain of the Sailfish ordered the attack. They fired torpedoes. Whoosh! Whoosh! The torpedoes hit. The Chuyo exploded and began to sink. The crew of the Sailfish cheered. It was a huge victory, but days later they received a message that made their blood run cold. The Chuyo wasn't just carrying planes, it was carrying prisoners of war. American prisoners. And who were those prisoners? They were the survivors of the USS Sculpin. Remember the Sculpin? That was the sister ship that found the Squalus in 1939. That was the ship that stood by while Momsen rescued the crew. The Sculpin had been sunk by the Japanese weeks earlier, and the survivors were being transported on the carrier. The Sailfish, the resurrected body of the Squalus, had just killed the men who had saved her original crew. It is a coincidence so dark it feels like fiction. Of the 21 survivors from the Sculpin on board that carrier, 20 perished. Only one man survived the sinking of the Chuyo. George Rochek was that man. He was on the Sculpin when it found the Squalus, and he was on the Chuyo when the Squalus, as the Sailfish, sank it. He survived both events. It brings up a lot of wild questions. Was the ship cursed? Was it destined to take lives to pay back the debt of the 33 men who were saved? Or is it just the brutal, random nature of war and the sea? Today, the conning tower of the USS Squalus stands in a park at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. You can go see it. It is a quiet monument. But the rest of the ship, it was eventually scrapped after the war. The metal was melted down. It became razor blades or cars or girders for buildings. So, parts of the Squalus might be all around us. The story of the Squalus is more than just a history lesson. It is a warning. It teaches us that technology is fragile, that a single green light can lie. It teaches us that bravery exists in the darkest places. Think of Sherman Shirley dying with the phone in his hand, and it leaves us with that nagging mystery. What did the divers really see in those windows? Did the 26th man really live for days in the airlock? And do we ever truly leave the past behind, or does it follow us like the Sailfish followed the Sculpin? The ocean is deep and it keeps its secrets well, but one thing is for sure, the 33 men who came up in that bell never forgot the 26 who stayed behind, and neither should we. Outro. So here's the controversial question. Do you think the Squalus was actually cursed, or was the sinking of the Sculpin just a horrific coincidence of war? Let me know your wild theories in the comments below, and if you want more deep-sea mysteries, hit that like button and subscribe right now.